This conference is now being recorded.
Welcome to Planning Your First Webinar. Your speaker for today's program is Dawn Cameron. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing £0. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may send chat questions at any time during the presentation using the chat window located to the right of the presentation. I will now turn the call over to our speaker. Dawn, you may begin.
Thanks, Ginny, and welcome everyone. And thank you for spending a few minutes with me learning how to plan an effective webinar. We've got a pretty good number of people registered for this presentation, which tells you that it's a topic that is on a lot of people's minds. If you're not currently delivering webinars, this presentation is going to give you the timeline and the planning steps necessary to make your first webinar a success. So I want you to sit back and relax. There's no need to be furiously taking notes. After we finish, I'm going to send each of you a webinar e-kit, and that e-kit contains a timeline, a checklist of tasks, a sample invitation, even a couple of follow-up email templates. So there's a lot of good information in there. So as we get started, let's summarize what we're going to cover. I'm going to guide you through each step in the webinar planning process in a simple-to-follow timeline format. So for the most part, I'll be answering the what and the when of delivering a webinar. The how and the whys of webinars, I explain in a separate presentation entitled The ABCs of Webinars that I'll be giving in a couple of weeks. If you have an interest in joining me for that presentation, let me know at the end of this webinar, and I'll make sure you get sent an invitation. This presentation is going to run about 25 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session for as long as you've got questions. Please feel free to pose your questions in the chat box in the lower right of your screen as they occur to you during the presentation. I'm not going to answer them until after, but at least that way they'll be in the front of the queue when I do start answering questions. Now, I'm not going to cover presentation skills since I'm assuming most of you will not be the presenter on your webinar. I've got materials on that topic which you can request if you're interested. However, I will be letting you in on the best kept secret in the webinar business, something WebEx, Adobe, GoToMeeting, and all the other web conferencing providers don't want you to know. So stay tuned for that in just a couple minutes. All right, so having said all that, let's get started. Say, you've had an epiphany and you want to start delivering webinars for whatever your purpose. Actually, you know what? Let's do a quick poll right now to see what purposes you folks are thinking you might want to use webinars for. This will only take a minute, and I'll share the results with you so you can get a sense of what the group is thinking. So let's just put this on your screen. And you can see that the question is, what's your main goal for conducting webinars? And I've listed, 4 plus a catch-all other. Quickly click on, whichever one applies to you or what you're thinking, and I'll share it with everybody just so we get a feel, and that way I can make sure that I'm directing the rest of this presentation on track with what people are doing. I don't want to take a lot of time at this. Looks like we have a lot of shy people out there not voting. But anyway, let's just cut this off and get going. I also just wanted to show you how the polling feature works, and you can be thinking in your own mind, how would I use this in my presentation? Because it's a very effective little tool. All right, so let's go. A lot of shy people, that's fine. So there you have it. Almost 40% are looking at lead generation, a quarter generating revenue. So it's scattered around a little bit. So let's get back to our presentation. Now, once you have your purpose clearly defined, you need to select your presenter and a date. No big surprise there, and I'm not going to take up your time discussing these, other than to say that if you're targeting office workers, you will generally want to hold your webinar midday during the week. though the best practices folks will tell you to never hold a webinar on a Monday and to avoid Fridays. In my experience, Fridays can work reasonably well. I think a lot of people feel they have a little extra time on Fridays. But with respect to choosing a speaker, depending on your purpose, having a household name is not important. And this webinar is a classic example. You folks don't know me. You've never heard of me. But you came here because of what you're going to learn. Content is what's important. Now, regarding choosing a technical vendor, you need to address this issue right up front. But before you make a decision on which vendor to choose, you need to make a more fundamental decision. Now, to put this decision into context, here's a list of the components for delivering a webinar. So you can see at a glance the entire process. Of course, you don't need the payment processing piece if your webinar is going to be free to attend. None of these are rocket science. But like anything else, if you haven't done them before, they take some figuring out. If you're going it alone, you need to pull together each of these pieces. If you go with a fully managed provider, you only have to worry about choosing your speaker and marketing your webinar. The provider looks after the rest and everything else, including the technology. So, the decision you need to make is, do you want to handle all of the steps of putting on the webinar yourself, or do you want some help? Some people will want help, some people won't. It depends on a number of factors that are specific to your situation, like how technically savvy you are, how much time you have to commit to the process, whether you have internal resources you can rely on. It's a personal decision you need to make based on your individual circumstances, but you need to make it at the beginning of the process. Now, relating back to our timeline, if you're going on your own for the first time, I recommend starting roughly 7 to 8 weeks in advance of your proposed date in order to give you sufficient time to manage the various steps in the process for the first time and not find yourself under a lot of stress. Okay, so let's get back to the vendor selection. Now, this is where I let you in on the best-kept secret in the webinar industry. Drum roll, please. It has to do with which web conferencing technology you should choose. Should it be WebEx, GoToMeeting, maybe Adobe or Microsoft's Live Meeting or Confertel's iPresent? Are any of you lying awake at night wondering which one of these you should go with? Well, don't, and I'll tell you why. And this is the secret that no one wants you to know. And the fact is, they're all pretty much the same. Each of these companies is trying to tell you that their technology is better than the others. But the fact is, if all you want to do is push PowerPoints, they have the same functionality, they cost about the same, and they're all reasonably simple to use. It doesn't matter which one you choose. Now, the caveat to that is if you're going to incorporate video or do a software demo or maybe have fancy animation flying in and out of your presentation, then one or more of these platforms is going to work better than others for your particular application. You need to try it out on a handful of different platforms. So the bottom line is this. If you do it yourself, it really doesn't matter which one you choose. And there are dozens to choose from. The only concern you might have is selecting a platform that does not require attendees to download a little software applet in order to view the presentation. Because while downloading the applet is quick and easy, for a small number of people, it can trigger firewall issues which basically result in these people missing the presentation. And of course, if you've got one person that's having problems, you're having to deal with them while 50 other people are sitting there waiting for you to continue the presentation. So, to name names, WebEx, GoToMeeting, and Live Meeting all require that download. I'm just touching the big names. Obviously, as I said, there's dozens out there. Platforms that don't require it are Adobe and Confertel. However, so that's sort of the kind of the do-it-yourself side. If you want to go the fully managed provider route, and have someone handle the entire process and the technology, there's only a handful of those out there, and we could certainly talk about the kind of service they provide during the Q&A process if there's an interest in that. All right, so before you start creating your webinar, your actual presentation, you have to answer another important question. Who are you trying to reach with your webinar? If you're charging people to attend your webinar, you'll probably accept just about anybody with a valid credit card. But if your event is free, then you're likely doing it for lead generation or product launch, and you need to be very clear about who you want to target. If you sell B2B, what industry, what title, what department? Are you looking for decision makers, end users, or just influencers? So let me give you an example. Let's say you are in the computer server business, and your webinar focuses on new server architecture, and by the way, you're going to cover how your new servers can do stuff the competition can't. The question is, do you want the engineers who use the servers, or do you want the CTO or CFO that make the decision and write the check? So you need to be very clear on your objective, then target your audience accordingly within your marketing and your invitation. Who you invite, how you describe the benefits they'll receive, and what content you'll use to make your case when you build your presentation are all driven by your purpose. And don't be afraid to state right on the invitation who the webinar is targeted to. People want to know that the content is designed specifically for them. Okay, so 6 weeks before the event, you should be getting on your presenter to make sure they're creating their presentation. If there's one thing that will cause you stress in the whole webinar process, it's the procrastinating presenter. So stay on them. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not going to cover presentation best practices, but here are a couple of quick tips to keep in mind, either for yourself or when your presenter sends you their slide deck. Just a couple of quickies. Number one, less text, more visuals. Okay, fewer words, more pictures. Number two, the rule of thumb is roughly one slide per minute. So, if you want to go 30 minutes, 30 slides, 45 minutes, 45 slides. Generally speaking, you don't want to go over 30 minutes, including your Q&A. I mean, if you're charging people $200 and it's a continuing education credit or something for lawyers, maybe you need to go an hour and a half. But basically, you should be shooting for no more than 45 minutes with maybe a 10-minute Q&A. Webcams, streaming a video of your presenter while they're doing their presentation. Always seems like a good idea at the time, but you really need to think twice about it. It doesn't allow your presenter's basically got to be looking at the webcam the whole time they're presenting, no walking around, no gesturing, no constantly reading their notes, which is a big hassle and a problem for presenters. And the other side of it is there can be connectivity problems because it requires a different level of connectivity by your attendees, and then you start getting into this firewall issue again. So think twice about the webcam. But your overarching goal here is to keep it short and keep it interesting. Now, I'm going to cover marketing in more detail shortly, but before you can start inviting people to your event, you need to have a way to register them. So let's quickly cover that. Online registration, where the attendee simply clicks a Register Now button and can register within 30 seconds, just like you did for this webinar, is far preferable than printing and mailing the registration form along with a check. I mean, you don't even want to think about going in that direction. If you don't already have the ability to register people through your own website, many of the conferencing tools like WebEx, Live Meeting, etc., have this capability. Unfortunately, the only one that includes payment processing, for those of you that want to charge for your event, that I'm aware of is Conferencel. Okay. To maximize attendance, it's important to know your audience. You need to deliver something they want, something they will spend their time on. To get the most number of people to attend, keep your topic narrow as possible. And I know this sounds counterintuitive. You think, well, I'll just have a little something for everybody and I'll get all kinds of people. Wrong. The narrower you make your topic, the deeper the dive you take into your presentation, the more people will show up. People can get general information anywhere with 3 clicks of their mouse. You need to give them something they can't get somewhere else, at least not easily. So it's got to be narrow, okay? And make your invitation all about the benefits your target audience will enjoy. All right, so this is key, so listen up. How you market is the most important element in the process. And there's 2 main marketing options that you've got: email and social media. Obviously, if you're a member-based organization and you have a member email list, your life is comparatively simple. But if you're going out to the public and you don't have a list of prospects with email addresses, then you need to get one before you can market via email. You can build it yourself, or there's hundreds of list brokers around with a variety of lists. Simply Google your industry and list, and they'll start popping up like mushrooms after a spring shower. You should also look around and try to find a marketing partner. This could be a trade organization or publication in your industry, basically anyone who already has an existing connection to your target market. And I can't emphasize that enough. That can be really key, and you can find ways to work together to your mutual benefit. Now, the other main marketing channel, if you're targeting, the public, is social media sites such as LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, yada, yada, yada. And this can be done without the use of an email list. As a matter of fact, over half of the people that register for this webinar came through social media. Now, this is new stuff and not something that most people know how to do currently, though I'm constantly amazed at how many consultant types claim that they do. I know that Confortel, through social media marketing, they're about the only provider I'm aware of that can actually deliver an audience to your event through social media marketing. But I would state that the only success I have seen in this space is for free events. Social media and paid events don't mesh, at least not at the moment. So if you're charging for your event, don't think you're going to get a lot of people through social media unless you've got a real hook. If you've got any more, any interest in that or learning more about it, we can cover it during the Q&A session. Okay, preparing a communications plan. Ooh, that sounds daunting, doesn't it? But it's not really such a big deal. All we're talking about is creating your email invitation and then using that as the basis for any other marketing pieces you need to send through other channels such as a newsletter, blog postings, website updates, possibly even a pay-per-click ad. If you do a good job in your invitation, it's the basis to do all of those. You also need to develop the registration page and confirmation emails as well as reminder notices to your people. All of these can just be shorter renditions of your invitation. Now, depending on the purpose of your webinar, maybe it's for lead generation or product launching, you may also be interested in delivering follow-up emails to attendees and non-attendees. And there's no reason why these can't be crafted at one time about 3 to 4 weeks out. All right, so I touched on the registration page a little earlier, when the issue of the registration process needed to be determined. But now it's 4 weeks out, and it's time to create the registration page with whatever registration process you've chosen. It starts with the usual, including the logo, time, date, speaker bio, as well as a synopsis of the invitation. There's that invitation again. You decide what information you want to gather from your registrants and have those fields in your form. Don't hesitate to recite, again, on the registration page, the benefits your attendees will enjoy. Never stop marketing, never stop selling, even on the registration page. All kinds of people get to registration pages and they bounce off. The other thing you don't want to do is have too many fields where it becomes a little oppressive. You don't really need much more than a name, a phone number, and an email. I see a lot of companies ask for a lot more information. Sort of depends on how compelling your content is. As I mentioned, if you're charging your participants to attend, then you're going to need to have a payment processing component integrated with the registration process. Or you could use a third-party payment processor like PayPal. It's kind of a two-step situation then. All right, so let's talk about the invitation. There are various factors that can affect the number of people that register, but the most important is the invitation, whether it's in an email or a landing page from a social media site. It needs to jump out with the benefit to the reader right up front, the first line or two. The headline needs to be attention-grabbing, even bordering on controversial. You've got to grab people's attention. Tell them who should be attending and what benefit they'll get from it. They have no interest in your product or necessarily the speaker's bio. They want to know what is going to be worth 45 minutes of their time, period. Okay? And do it with bullets. Don't do it with boring-looking text. Now, if you're going to market via social media, the same principles apply. As I mentioned, marketing free webinars on social media can work like a charm if you know what you're doing. However, marketing paid webinars on social media does not work, at least not so far. I have not come across anyone that's found the secret to success for marketing paid webinars through social media. So, for paid webinars, you want to start your marketing a little earlier than for free webinars. Attending a free webinar seems to be a fairly spontaneous act, though neither paid nor free requires the same amount of time as an in-person event because nobody has to leave their office. Generally speaking, you should begin email marketing a paid webinar roughly 3 weeks in advance and a free webinar roughly 2 weeks in advance. If you're marketing through social media, you should add a week. You've got to get viral through all the social media sites. So, counterintuitively, do not start marketing too early. Okay, so let's talk about marketing. The popular belief in advertising is you need at least 7 impressions before an advertiser registers with a consumer. Now, I'm not recommending that you go that far with your webinar promotion. You'd be shot if you did. However, if you are marketing via email, even to a list of members, a minimum of 2 to 3 emails is necessary for success. And I can tell you unequivocally, you will not succeed if you do not send out your email invitation at least twice. Now, you don't run into the same issue with social media because obviously it's more viral in nature, and you put your stuff out there and it's out there. And here's the interesting thing, which is very different from an in-person meeting. Almost half your attendees will register in the last week, especially if your webinar is free. So, again, don't start marketing your event too far in advance. And I can tell you for a fact this webinar was no different. Almost a quarter of you registered within the last 48 hours. And one more thing. There are a number of, and this is fairly important, so make a mental note here. There are a number of websites that will list your webinar for free, and they are becoming more and more effective. A year ago, not so much, but now, I've got a couple of clients that regularly get up to 25 to 30% of the registrants, through these sites. And the listings, as I say, they're free, and they'll also help your overall SEO efforts, your search engine optimization efforts, because these sites are linked all over the place. I mean, that's their job. So that's something that you don't want to overlook because you just put the same information into each one of those sites, so it's not a lot of work. All right. You want to schedule speaker training a week in advance for a few reasons, not the least of which is it forces the presentation to be ready in plenty of time. As I mentioned, speaker procrastination can be a real pain in the butt, especially if they're a third party over which you have no control and you can't just walk down the hall and wrap your fingers around their throat. So, if you're doing it yourself, you need to make sure the presenter is trained on the web conferencing software that you've chosen and will be comfortable using it when it's showtime. You also want to make sure your presenter has practiced, and this is key, out loud and isn't going to stumble during the presentation. I can't emphasize how important it is to actually practice out loud as opposed to just reading it to yourself. It also provides you with an opportunity to hear the presenter in action if it's not you. If they don't sound good to you, they're not going to sound good to your audience. If the presenter's inexperienced, ensure they are familiar with basic presentation best practices, voice modulation, pausing, that sort of thing. If you need a resource for that, let me know. I can provide you with a white paper or even a 45-minute recorded presentation which you could send on to your presenter. Okay. You can have the audio portion of the presentation be delivered over the phone or through the computer speakers of your audience. For this presentation, I gave you the choice. If you're going via conference call, there's lots of phone conferencing companies out there, including whoever provides your long distance for you. However, if you want to record the presentation, you want to make sure that the phone and the web pieces are integrated. Normally, all of the attendees are muted during the presentation, just like now. This is important. This avoids interruptions and background noise, which can be very disruptive. There's nothing worse than having someone, one of your attendees, put the conference call on hold for a minute while someone comes into their office, and all of a sudden you've got music playing over top of your presenter. It kills the momentum in a real hurry. Now, with respect to recording the presentation, there's two reasons to have the presentation recorded. First, you want to be able to send a link to the recording to the people that registered but couldn't make it at the last minute. And second, you want to think about archiving the recording on your website and maybe developing an educational library over time. The other thing you can do is get it out onto YouTube. YouTube is now the second most popular search engine on the web, so get it out there. Okay, so someone needs to facilitate the webinar. This person familiarizes the presenter with the process, makes introductions, explains to attendees how and when they can ask questions, troubleshoots any technical issues, and facilitates the Q&A process. Today, Jenny's doing that for us. If you're putting on a webinar on your own, this is likely going to be you. If you go the fully managed route, this person comes with the service. You get somebody like Jenny. During the pre-conference, you should have your presenter push a couple of the slides forward and back to make sure everything is working properly. Now, hopefully you prepared the introduction script a couple of weeks earlier if you're ahead of the game. Each of these issues should have been part of your dry run with the presenter a week earlier, and what you're doing during the pre-conference is just confirming everything, such as who will recite the questions from the chat window, when will they be answered, will it be during the presentation or after, that sort of thing. Okay, so it's showtime. You should send a quick chat message to the audience a minute before you start so that they see the chat window, and when you refer to it in your introductory remarks about how to ask questions, they know what you're talking about. It's also a courtesy to let them know that you're going to be starting on time or within a minute or two. If you're offering the phone option for audio, make sure the attendees are muted. Like I said, take my word for this one. You do not want unexpected background conversations or music on hold playing over top of your presenter. The rest of it we've talked about already. Here's the key. What gets you through the actual event without a hiccup is preparation and practice. You as the person producing the webinar, you do the preparation. Your presenter does the practice. Now, virtually all web conferencing software has annotation tools, as well as the ability to ask the audience polling questions during a presentation. Now, your presenter probably won't use the annotation tools unless the slides are technical in nature, but just so you understand, this is what they look like. You can come in here and I can circle stuff, or I can come up here and grab a pointer and point to stuff, and stuff move around. So I mean, it can be useful, especially if you've got very complicated slides, if they're technical in nature. But polling helps keep your audience. It does two things. It keeps your audience engaged. It can also be used to ensure people are paying attention, especially if the content of the course maybe is for certification, educational units or something. Now, using chat, and you can see the chat window on the lower right-hand part of your screen, helps facilitate the Q&A session at the end of your presentation. As I mentioned before, feel free to pose your questions as they occur to you. That way they'll be at the front of the queue when I start answering questions. It's also a good idea to pop a survey immediately after the session to gather attendee feedback. And I'm going to give you a chance to experience just how that post-event survey works right after this presentation, so you can see how simple it is. And again, then you can be thinking about how would I use this in my own webinar, and what would I ask after the fact. Now, depending on the purpose of your webinar, you're going to have a desired follow-up procedure. Whatever it is, it needs to be determined well before the day of the event. This is something that you're thinking about and creating communications around roughly 2 weeks in advance. Remember what your end game is. What's your purpose? And use the follow-up communication to solidify it. If you're providing training to members, solicit topics of interest from them maybe for the next one. If you're trying to generate sales leads, offer them more education on the subject or maybe a special discount. So think about what your end game is and use the follow-up information to achieve it. Okay, so we've gone through a timeline that starts roughly 8 weeks out and ends a few days after the event. The fact is, once you've done a couple of these, they can be done in half the time, so long as you have the various pieces in place, like your speaker, registration process, invitation template, the software, etc. Now, I emphasize that the most important decision you need to make is not what technical vendor you choose, but whether you're going to go it on your own or whether you want assistance. If you're going it on your own, you need to pull together each of the pieces that you can see on your screen. If you're going to get help from a fully managed provider, you just have to worry about choosing your speaker and marketing your webinar. Your provider looks after the rest of it, including the phone and web technology and the technical support for attendees that may have trouble joining your webinar, and that does happen, as I say, especially if you're using a technology that has the applet requirement. So here's my advice. Until you've been through the process a time or two, it's helpful to have someone who's going to hold your hand through each step. And there's 2 reasons for this. First, they ensure nothing falls through the cracks and that the event runs smoothly and professionally. But secondly, it allows you to focus on more strategic issues, like getting more people to attend, as well as all the aspects of your day job that you've still got to do. So, tell you what, let's do another poll real quick, and this time we'll put you on the psychiatrist's couch and ask you about your deepest webinar fears. All right, let's see what people are thinking. So let's just ask the question, what's your biggest concern about holding webinars? And just go ahead, just quickly vote, and we'll share the information so everybody kind of gets a feel for what it is that they're concerned about, and then maybe we can address some of that in the Q&A session. I don't want to take a whole bunch of time doing this. I, again, want to show the polling function, see how it works, have you thinking about how you would use it. All right, so let's just end this. A bunch of shy people still, but that's fine. There you have it. Over half the people are uncertain of the technology. Completely understandable. You know, only, almost a quarter of you are uncertain or aren't enamored with the idea of having to deal with all the administration around it. Finding a good speaker, you know, it can be an issue. So let's get back and move on. All right, so here are a couple of common mistakes you want to avoid. The first is trying to do too much with any individual event. As I sort of alluded to this earlier, a lot of people will try to do too much with a single webinar. They think by having a little something for a whole variety of people, they're going to draw a bigger crowd. And nothing could be further from the truth. People are looking for content that addresses their specific needs. Surprisingly, the narrower the topic, the deeper the dive, the more people will attend, and certainly the more people that you want to attend will attend. Second is failing to make your invitation exciting. What's in it for me? Is what I will learn worth an hour of my time? How will what I learn make me money or save me money? That's what everyone who looks at your invitation is asking themselves. And if your invitation doesn't promise something very specific and something very compelling, you will not draw a crowd. If your invitation fails to convey value, people are not going to register. And it doesn't really matter how good your actual presentation is, because no one's going to be there to see it. Focus on that invitation. The third common mistake is, not executing a solid marketing plan. While 20% response rate to a webinar invitation sent by email is possible, I've never seen it done. Yet many webinar people think that just because they've got a good content and maybe a sexy speaker and it's free, that the audience is going to turn out in droves, and it just doesn't work that way. Especially in markets where there's a lot of competing messages, vendors and webinars going on, it generally will be a lot harder than you realize to get registrants for your webinar. For email, you can think about a 2 to 3 response rate as being fairly successful. Okay, as I mentioned, later today I will send you an e-kit entitled Planning a Successful Webinar, which includes task lists, sample emails, timelines, worksheets, even a sample budget. Now, I don't want to bury you with information for which you may not have an immediate need. In the quick survey that's going to pop after we sign off here, remember I said I'd show you what that looks like, you'll have an opportunity to request material on any specific topic, presentation tips, building, best practices for building PowerPoints, that sort of thing, and I'll be happy to email that to you. Okay, so I have prattled on long enough. I have gone over my time. Now we're going to open this up to questions. Jenny, would you please give the instructions on how our guests can ask questions, including using the chat function?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press 7# on your phone now, and you'll be placed in the queue in the order received. Listen for your name to be announced and be prepared to ask your question when prompted. You may also continue to send chat questions in the chat window to the right of the presentation.
Okay, Jenny, just before we take the live questions, so we did solicit questions from the group yesterday, and I did get a number of responses. I dealt with most of those in the presentation. However, there was a few that either I didn't get to or maybe I could embellish a little bit. The first one was, how do you select a webinar tool like WebEx and others? What's important to ask in the selection process? Well, like I was saying, if you have a simple presentation of PowerPoint, doesn't really matter. You're going to ask them how much it costs and whether there's this applet download. Other than that, they're going to be, all very, very similar. But if you do have something more exotic, you want a demo software or something, then you need to actually test your presentation out on their platform, and most of them will give you the opportunity to do that at no cost. Second question, do any of the web conferencing tools have the ability to test attendees on the content of the webinar at the end? Yeah, a lot of associations and organizations that issue continuing education credits, that sort of thing, need or want to be able to test at the end. Sometimes it's quite elaborate. Sometimes they just want to make sure people are still awake or still there. And there are a handful of tools out there that do it. I know GoToTraining from GoToMeeting does. I know Confertel does. I think WebEx has some kind of post-event. But one of the things here is that you may want to look at a vendor that actually can mark, not only test the attendees, but mark them and even send them an electronic certificate. So there are some things to consider there if you're going down that path. Number 3, what requirements have to be met to host paid webinars for educational credit? How many agencies? Who are they? To be clear here, if you're looking to be issuing educational credit, that has nothing to do with your webinar vendor. The accreditation of educational webinars is done by the governing body. So whether that's on a state basis, which it often is, or federally, there's an association, and I've done a lot with bar associations, and that's a state-by-state thing, and each bar association determines whether the content is worth credit, and if so, how much. So that's who you would get your approval from, just so we're clear. It's not a webinar vendor type of situation. Okay, a few more questions here. How do you prepare for a webinar? How many PowerPoint slides? I talked about that. What other sources and software do you normally use? I just use, as you saw, I don't even use a webcam for the reasons we talked about. And you really don't need anything other than using PowerPoint. You can use Camtasia if you want to get some animation going in there and maybe do some canned voiceover, but you don't really need any other equipment or software to do your basic presentation. I did touch on the problem with webcams, so I won't go into that. Next question is, do you have a template for organizing the structure of your webinar? The only template that I use, and Rhonda Good, you brought this up in your question, is and I'm sure most of you have heard this before, you start out by saying, okay, telling your audience what they're going to learn, then you teach them, and then you summarize what you taught them. Okay, some people call that the 3 T's but it's basically that. Tell them up front what they're going to learn, just in a few bullets. Teach them that information, and then summarize it. The bottom line, if you're like me, you come to these things thinking, if I can just come away with 2 or 3 ideas that I can employ, then it's worth my time. So press that, and you know what those ideas are if you're the presenter. Highlight those at the front, highlight them at the end, okay? And then people will leave thinking, okay, that was worth my while. Okay, here's one. I attend lots of other webinars and notice that there's a lot of BS at the beginning. Okay. What do you recommend? Summarizing things. Here's my advice. People, unless you're Bill Gates, people don't care who you are as a presenter, and they don't want to hear about your credentials, and they don't want to know your family life, and they're not about to marry you, and they're not asking you to do open heart surgery on them. All they want, their interest is in the content. Just let them know that you're qualified to give the content. Don't get into detail, and then just give it to them. The content will speak for itself. All right. Okay, here's a good question. Are the steps to prepare a webinar different, whether it's lead generation or a product launch webinar compared to an educational webinar? And no, the steps aren't different. The only difference may be that if you're doing a product launch or lead generation, you're going to have a more detailed follow-up process. And that is part of the webinar preparation, but it executes after the actual presentation. So that's the significant difference, unless, of course, you need to be able to be demonstrating your product and you're using video or you're demonstrating it through a software or something. Then, of course, it comes back to what platform you're going to use to do that with. And last question here is, at product promotion webinars, when do you mention the product? And the key here to understand is if you're doing lead generation or product promotion, webinars are not a sales opportunity. They are not. Do not sell in a webinar. The purpose of the webinar is to attract people who have an interest in what you're talking about. And if you're talking about something like a problem that your company has the ability to solve, then those are the people that you want to educate to their problem. And after the fact, you can mention it at the end saying, yes, and we have the ability to solve this problem, and we'll follow up with you. Educate first and don't sell. You educate first. Second, you create awareness of your product or service, and only after the presentation, okay, after it's all said and done, then you follow up with these people and you move into sales mode, and not before. It's a cardinal sin if you do. Okay, so that is it with all the pre-questions. Jenny, do we have any questions left of the people that are with us today?
We have quite a few questions, Don.
Oh, no. Okay.
First question, what is a fair fee for a webinar service?
It all comes down to what's the value of it to your audience. I've got a client that charges $225 to $250 because he provides very in-depth, subject-specific information to high-profile attorneys. We also have nonprofit church group that charges $49 for an hour on nonprofit tax issues. What I can say is this: is that the general rule is that your price is between $50 and $100, $49 to $99. But it is going to depend on the economic status of your audience and how compelling your content is. Jenny?
Yes. Another question. Does Confertel have social media integration within their platform? How do they drive social media audience?
Well, there's two things. I guess there's two levels to that question. One is, and I didn't touch on this today, but because that's more on the how and the why of the ABCs, but you can be using Twitter and tweeting away while you're giving your presentation. Obviously not the presenter. You'd have to have somebody on the side, the producer, doing that. But the social media work needs to be done well in advance, other than sort of that live situation. The social media work has to be done well in advance. Okay? So let's look at it three ways. In advance, you need to be creating awareness with links to your registration page to get people signed up. While the presentation is going on, you can be tweeting and getting more people to attend. After the fact, you take your recorded presentation and you push it back out through social media as well as YouTube so that it's out there and it's got a life of its own. Again, this is dependent on your purpose, of course. If your event is a paid-for event, if you're requiring people to pay, you can still do the same thing and just put a little e-commerce gateway in front of it. And if you don't have the ability to do that, there are providers that can do that and will do it for just a share of the the fees paid by the people that come in and watch it. So that's another option. Jenny?
The next question, what tools do you recommend to manage your communications, invites, confirmations, reminders, and follow-up?
Well, I mean, that's most of the the well-known web conferencing platforms that I've mentioned have that capability built in. Some of the lesser ones, maybe not quite so robust, don't have it, but the bigger ones do. So they will they can provide that to you. I know Confertel in particular will send out reminders 24 hours before, an hour before, to make sure that you get the maximum number of people attending that actually registered. But the other platforms also have similar functionality. And that's why I say there's not a huge difference when it comes to functionality between the major platforms. Jenny?
Do you recommend a staggered registration page to get more information from people?
Yeah, that's interesting. My feeling is this: you get the least information possible. I mean, unless you're getting hundreds and thousands of people out, you're going to want to. I guess let me take a couple of steps back. If people are paying, or they're getting some kind of educational credit, then sure, you're going to ask them, 8 or 10 questions, and they'll answer them because they need to get the credit. But if it's a free webinar and you're just generating sales leads, or it's a product launch, you don't want to be getting a lot of that information. Get a little bit, but don't cross the line. Your sales efforts, your first phone call back to them after the event can gather that information. So the problem is, and I don't have the stats at my fingertips, I used to, but the number of fields, for every additional field you add, you can lose 5 to 10% of the people off your registration page. So be cautious about that. Jenny?
How many hours are required to plan and prepare for presenting a webinar?
Well, that all depends on whether you've done it before or not. Obviously, that's a huge one. It also depends on whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're using a fully managed provider. It depends on whether you're including the time required to prepare the actual presentation. Because and then of course then there's the marketing, and so everybody's circumstances are different. I would be very reticent to throw a number of hours out there, but if you look at your checklist, you have to figure, just go through that and attribute a certain amount of time to each task, and that's, as I say, one thing. The good news is after you've done it once or twice, the time gets cut in half or much less than that. And of course, if you're going with a fully managed provider, you don't have to worry about the technology or any of that stuff. You just market your event and chase after your presenter. So bottom line is, go through your task list, assign your own time, because it's going to be unique to every individual. Jenny?
Yes. One person would like some input on their email subject line, the length, content, how to help draw people in to open the message.
Well, there is a lot of, you can get a lot of advice on that, and my advice, not to duck the question, but really to do the best for you, is to simply, my advice is to Google email subject lines, and there will be dozens of articles on what you should be looking at, and it will vary depending on purpose and audience, et cetera, et cetera. But I can't do justice to it. That's not my specific expertise, but there's a real simple way to get the best information. And so that's what I would recommend you do.
We have a number of people who have requested information on the listing services, and we also have a number of people who have requested the white paper, particularly a white paper regarding presentation skills.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Here's what I want you to do: is a little survey is going to pop on your screen as soon as we're done. It's going to ask you, about 3 or 4 little multiple choice questions, and I'd appreciate you filling it out because it gives me a little bit of feedback as to whether and it'll just take you 10 seconds. This is not like you don't have to type anything; you just click a radio dial. But it gives me a little feedback as to whether I'm hitting the mark or not, because I do like to constantly try to make my presentations better and more useful. But at the bottom of that is a little field, a little box, and you can just type in there, send me the the free listing site list, or white paper presentations, or if you want the actual presentation skills, we can send that along to you. And by the way, I didn't do that. It was done by another expert by the name of Ken Millay. So just whatever you want, put it in that box, and we will get it to you. Anything else, Jenny?
I have clarification on an earlier question. A participant had asked, what is a fair fee for a webinar service?
Oh, a webinar service.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, I maybe I jumped the gun there, and I sort of what do you charge for people to attend? The webinar service, if you're a do-it-yourselfer and you can do it yourself, you should be able to get. I mean, assuming you're not planning on getting thousands of people to attend, you should be able to get the webinar platform technology for $100 to $150 a month, and that gives you, when I say unlimited usage, you can't have 5,000 people on there, but you could have 100 people on there and do a different webinar every day, and it wouldn't cost you any more. So, the cost of the platform is not expensive, right? It's less than $150 in virtually all cases. And if you're going to a fully managed provider, then it depends on really what you want them to do. And they all price themselves differently. Some have minimums. One has you need to prepay. I know Confortel. What I like about their model is that they only charge per registrant for people that they've collected money from. They collect the money on your behalf, take a per registrant fee, and then they write you a check in 10 days after the event. So they're writing you a check. You're not writing them a check. And if it's a free event with them, you only pay for the number of people that actually showed up. So that's a good model to compare against other vendors that are out there, because, as I say, on the fully managed side, there's all kinds of different models. There's not all kinds, because there's not that many providers, but each one of them seems to have a different approach to it. Are there any other questions, Jenny?
The last question has to do with social media marketing. The caller uses email blasts, but wonders if there's other ways to effectively use social media for marketing webinars.
Okay, well, I don't consider email to be social media. Email is email. Social media is getting out there on the blogs, blogging about it, and if you're not familiar with blogging, there are different sites that aggregate blogs, so you can just go in there and plug it in, just like you go to these free listing sites and plug in your listing, similar to that. The thing about social media is this: you can't just start it for a webinar. It's something that takes months and months and months, and it needs to be part of your whole overall corporate marketing strategy. You can't just pick it up for a webinar. So just so we're clear on that. If you're already into social media, great, you plug this in. If you're not, you're too late to do it for a webinar. You already have to be doing it. Anything else, Jenny?
A caller has asked for clarification on who is putting this webinar on.
This webinar is sponsored by Confortel, and they are a fully managed provider, and they also, like WebEx and Adobe and those guys, you can just license their technology and do it on your own. But they're the ones that are picking up the tab for this. Any other questions, Jenny?
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining me today. I hope you felt your time was well spent and that you're leaving with the basic information and timeline for planning your first webinar. As you head off, there's some specific things to remember. Number one, marketing is the most important element of the process. Success or failure depends on your marketing. Number two, the narrower your topic, the more people will register. Number three, web conferencing technologies are all pretty much the same, so don't drive yourself crazy looking for material differences. Number four, decide if you want help or not pulling it together. That's your really most important decision. And marketing via email or social media, those are your two main choices. Though by all means, use the free online webinar calendar sites if your event's free. And definitely look to try and partner with whomever you can that might already have a relationship with your target audience. As I mentioned, a survey is going to pop on your screen as soon as we sign off here. If you would just take like 10 seconds and give me some feedback on what you've just heard, I'd really appreciate that. I'm going to be delivering a couple of webinars in the next month. I think one of them is the ABCs of webinars. The other is, I think, using webinars to generate qualified sales leads. If that's your goal with webinars, then I highly recommend you attend that presentation. Okay, well, that's it. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and enjoy the weekend. Thanks, everyone.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.